the fire sermon is one of my favourite chants. It's a very powerful teaching that the Buddha gave, and traditionally we think of it as his third sermon. The first one was to, the first two sermons were to the first 5 ascetics who had practiced alongside him for a number of years, and then abandoned him when he started to take care of himself a bit, eating solid food and getting a little bit stronger after his fasting had led him to the point of death. They'd become disaffected, disillusioned, because they felt he'd given in, he'd weakened, rather than seeing it was the arising of wisdom, and finding a balance between the extremes of asceticism and indulgence, and a very necessary part of his process in order to regain the strength that was needed for him to win through to perfect enlightenment. And as many of you will have heard, they had some resistance to hearing his first teaching, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the setting in motion of the wheel of Dhamma. And then the second sermon, the teaching on not self, contemplating the nature of conditions, the form, feeling, perception, mental formations and consciousness. And then this third sermon, which was given to a much larger gathering. This time there were 1,000, comprising others who'd been inspired by teachings he'd given on different occasions, sort of shorter teachings, and then the matted hair ascetics who had become interested in the Buddha and the way of life and practice that he was living. And he gave this sermon. I mean, he must have given more teachings for them to have become interested, but then this one, which was recorded, which was memorized and passed down for a number of years before it was actually written down. This teaching on the senses, basically. A contemplation of the way that we're affected by what we perceive through the senses. The eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and the mind itself. He speaks about these as burning. And maybe first of all it's interesting just to contemplate the nature of fire. And I'm extremely fortunate. I live in a kuti. Well, when I stay here, I generally stay in a kuti where there's a stove, a wood-burning stove. And so I have opportunity to contemplate fire a lot, especially in the winter time where I'm quite dependent on the warmth from the fire, the wood burning. And just noticing the characteristic of fire, how it burns, how it consumes. It consumes the wood. You put wood in, and then there's air passing through and the flame, and it consumes, and there's a tremendous amount of heat that comes, which in the context of a wood-burning stove is very good news. that it has the characteristic to produce heat and to consume, and fire just consumes and consumes and consumes. I mean, as long as there's wood being put onto the fire, it'll just consume this wood, and in the end there's ash. And when we stop putting fire on the stove, then it stops burning. It goes out, and there's coolness. So the Buddha uses fire as a simile, as of a way of describing the effects of different kinds of contact through different senses. He says it's like a fire burning with the fire of greed, the fire of hatred, the fire of delusion. These different kinds of wanting. Now this is a teaching that the Buddha gave in order to help us to understand the reasons why we suffer, the ways that when we don't really understand the ways that life can become difficult for us. This sense of inflammability. I mean, I think all of us would like to think of ourselves as being cool, not easily ruffled, placid, gentle, not easily disturbed. I remember when I was a layperson, I used to think of myself as being very cool. And I remember people saying, one time I had a job as a waitress in a restaurant in Edinburgh, and I remember people commenting on how placid I was, how not very easily ruffled. And so that's how I thought of myself. And then I became a nun and discovered that actually I was very easily ruffled. There were many things, and I think, we can think of ourselves as being not easily ruffled, but then when we come into this life and shave off our heads, put on these robes, become part of a monastic community, and my sense it's intensified for monks and nuns, but it's also can be the same for lay people when they come into the community, when they come even just to spend a few days and suddenly find that they're not able to follow every little desire as it arises. There's very definite times that food is allowed. It's not that we have to fast the whole time, but it's not really acceptable to go into the kitchen and have a biscuit or a sandwich or a can of Coke or something whenever we feel like it. There's very definite restrictions on the extent to which we can just satisfy our desires, and these precepts that we undertook or that were given just now, the 8 precepts, where undertaking to practice restraint in quite a number of areas, in ways that maybe are not part of, for a layperson, their habits. It's easy to turn on the TV when you feel a bit bored or upset about something. Just put on the TV, and if you get upset by what's on the TV, then you can turn it off, read a book, phone a friend. These ways that we can distract ourselves. So we don't have. When there are many ways that we can distract ourselves, it's more difficult to appreciate the ways that we can feel frustrated and upset, the desires as they arise in the mind. And so monastic life is a constant frustration, really. And as I said, for monks and nuns it's even further intensified because we have more restrictions on what we do, how we walk, how we sit, how we interact with each other. So it's as though we kind of, we're a little bit more raw in some ways, a little bit more exposed. There's less opportunity to not notice. And this is a very deliberate, it's a very carefully thought out form, container for us to live within, to enable us to appreciate these fires that arise all the time. So the eye is burning. Eye objects, sights are burning. We can contemplate this. Each one of us has different things that we can get upset about, that we see. Different sights that can upset us. I mean, I have a thing about lighting. So up at Milne Hume, there's a certain light that people put on, like when they're preparing the breakfast. And I really don't like overhead lighting. So when I come into the space where we have breakfast and I see this light on, I immediately go and put on another light, just because I don't like it. And it's a small fire. It's not a very dramatic fire, but I notice every time I go in there and see this light on, I immediately respond by turning off that light and putting on another light. You know, other people get upset about the way that people wear their robes, or the colour of their robes, or the way they wear their hat, or if their socks are falling down. There's a lot of concern about sort of concertina-style sock wearing. Or where people put their shoes. You know, you might notice, people consistently don't put their shoes in the racks. That's another of the things I sometimes get concerned about. I used to be the health and safety person here, and health and safety people can be very concerned about piles of shoes in entranceways, because what happens if there's a fire? How do you get out? Fall over those shoes. So that's another thing that one can, you just see this thing and there's a kind of inner reaction. And then hearing. If the chanting's not to our liking, we can get very distressed about that. The way people pronounce the different words, or if it's too high or too low, or too fast or too slow, or off key, we can feel, we can have a strong reaction just to the sound of the chanting, or the aeroplanes flying overhead, and disturb our practice, disturb our calm. And this is before we even contemplate the sound of people's voices, and the things that they say, it's just sound. But then, when we hear sound, when we actually interpret the sound into some kind of language, and a language that we understand, then that sets off a whole other thing in the mind. Have you noticed how much easier it is to listen to the sound of people speaking if you can't understand what they're saying? If people speaking in a foreign language is often, much easier. You can just let it go on without feeling disturbed by it. Whereas, it was interesting coming down on the train, because I was in the quiet coach, and there were some quite interesting conversations going on around me, and noticing, sort of, first of all thinking, well, they shouldn't be talking so loudly. This is a quiet coach, don't they realize? But then actually finding their conversations quite interesting, and noticing my ear just being drawn, being interested, being drawn into the conversation. It was a small fire. It wasn't a kind of massive conflagration of the sort that can arise when somebody might say something that's upsetting to us. Have you noticed in community how somebody can say something. It can be quite a minor thing, but we just can get really outraged, really inflamed. And it can trigger a whole conflagration, a whole series of inner reactions that can stay with us for days. We can have, the memory of that thought, of that conversation, that thing that was said to us. So it's not just the hearing. It's actually what we make of it in the mind, which is actually jumping a little bit to the mind consciousness, to the mind organ. I mean, in Buddhism, mind is also considered to be a sense base, because there's the reception, with a perception. There's contact. Let's get back to the basics. That there's a sense impression and a contact, and then we perceive it, we recognize it, it has an effect, it registers as being this thing, and then it gets interpreted in the mind. And so this is where things can really begin to happen. And as I said, it can go on for days, years even. If I work hard, I can actually remember things that can still have a little charge, of that really difficult thing that somebody said to me, really upsetting thing that somebody said, and I can remember it, and then the memory can trigger another whole conflagration. So there's sight, chakku and rupa, so sight and objects that we can see. Then there's sound and hearing and sound objects, the ear and hearing, and then smell. And I often talk about smell because I have quite a powerful sense of smell, and it was very sweet during Ajahn Sumedho's retreat, after the morning puja, walking back to my kuti, and the smell of, I've often talked about this actually, so you'll have to forgive me for repeating myself, but the fragrance of the toast in the retreat centre, and just the sort of the cheerful feeling that, the cheerful association of just the smell of toast being made. I knew I wasn't going to have any, but it didn't matter. Just it was a cheerful fragrance. So we can notice the effect of perception, the perception through the nose. And I was actually just remembering how in supermarkets, I mean, they use this. I mean, they can have they can actually sort of put fragrances into the air to make you interested in buying their products. So the smell of freshly baked bread, immediately, you come into the supermarket with a list of things you're going to buy, and bread isn't on the list, but then you go in, there's this wonderful fragrance of freshly baked bread, and so, immediately you think, yes, bread, I must get some bread, and you buy this bread, and so just to see how we can be fooled into wanting things. The desire can be stimulated just through a fragrance. Or in the airport lounges, and I'm embarrassed to admit that I fly quite a lot, and you come into this, after you've gone through security where they tell you have to get rid of all your liquids and everything, then you go into the next bit where they try to get you to buy all these liquids, water and then alcohol, and then the perfume section. You walk into this perfume section, all these fragrances, just trying to get you to to buy perfumes and things. So smell is actually a very, very evocative, very powerful sense. The autumn time, the fragrance of the leaves and the earth. We can contemplate that, and just noticing how the extent to which it can trigger things. I mean, fragrance is very evocative. It can bring up memories, so it links in very much with the mind, which as we all know is a place where it's just bung full of memories, zillions, millions of memories that can just be triggered by a fragrance, and then as the memory is triggered, it can lead us back into previous experiences, pulling us away from what's happening right here and now. So fragrance, taste, how certain tastes just make us want more of particular kinds of food, or whereas other tastes, the things that we don't like, can also stimulate another reaction. Bodily sensations. I mean, the body is a sense organ, and there's just so many pleasant and unpleasant, pleasant and painful sensations that we can have through the body. And just noticing the reaction to the different sensations in the body. Pleasant sensations we want more. Painful sensations we want to get rid of as quickly as possible. And then this mind, as I said, this mind which is just so reactive. So having a human body with these sense bases, in one way, it's a great blessing that we have these senses, because they're our link with what is outside of our bodies. They help us to see what's dangerous. They help us to see, what we need to survive, and how to protect ourselves. It's a very great blessing that we have these senses. We need these senses to survive. We wouldn't manage to live very long without them. And yet, so much of our reactivity is superfluous in some ways. It leads us into all kinds of papancha, all kinds of proliferation that just causes a lot of internal agitation, internal fire. The fire of greed, the fire of hatred or aversion, negativity, and delusion. I was contemplating this earlier on, having a conversation with someone about just the many, how each one of us has a different sense of things, a different reality. And just contemplating the monastery here, I have my perception, my world that I live in here at Amaravati. My way of seeing things, my way of interpreting things, my way of relating to things, my way of relating to the other nuns, my way of relating to Ajahn Sundra and to each of the other sisters, to the anagārikas, my way of relating to each of the monks, my way of perceiving them, my way of relating to the lay women, the ones I know very, very well, the ones I'd never met before, the lay men, some of whom I know quite well, some of whom I don't know so well. These different relationships. The perception of where I stay. I mean, very few people actually know the kuti where I stay. Very few people have ever been there. And for me, this is very, very familiar. It's where I spend a lot of time. And the walk from my kuti to the temple. And for each one of you, I mean, I have been to the laymen's accommodation once, I think, or maybe twice. I've been in the bhikkhu vihara. In fact, I helped build the bhikkhu vihara. That might be a surprise to you, but I did. We put up walls, we put up partitions. So there are bits of it that I have seen, and I know how the walls are constructed. But I don't know what it's like now. It's not part of my world as I experience Amaravati now. So the temple is a place that all of us are familiar with. All of us come here. But my place where I usually sit is on this side, and it's here at the front. And other people. So what I see when I sit here is quite particular, whereas for other people the view of the temple is different. The ones who sit at the back see all of us from the back. When I sit here, I see all of you from the front. And this is a particular view that a few people have, but many of you don't have the opportunity to see the temple from this angle. So we all have slightly different views, ways of seeing things. The view of the kitchen, for some of you the kitchen is very, very familiar. For others of us, we don't often go into the kitchen except when it's our washing up time. So our worlds are rather different, even though we're all part of this community. It's interesting, community has been something that as nuns we've been contemplating. What makes community? And maybe some of you don't feel you're part of the community at all because maybe you're visitors, but right now you're all part of this community. This is part of what we share, being here, contemplating the Dhamma, joining in the chanting or listening to the chanting. This is part of our experience, which is very different, say, from the experience of the people who are in Great Gadsden, or the other people who are in Great Gadsden right now. So this is interesting, isn't it? Well, I think it's interesting. It helps me to understand the teaching that the Buddha gave, just to help us about how we each create our own worlds, our own perception of the world and our place in the world. I was saying to somebody today how I used to find that a very, in some ways, an annoying teaching, because I think it's because I hadn't really understood it. I didn't really know what it meant. But as I've come to contemplate these teachings and to contemplate my life and my experience and to contemplate the fact that my experience is quite different from everybody else's experience, I begin to see, yes, this is what the Buddha meant. And my way of interpreting things is probably very different. The things that make me happy are probably different from what make other people happy. The things that cause me suffering are probably different from what cause other people suffering. The things that create these little infernos that the Buddha was talking about in the fire sermon. Eye is burning, ear is burning, nose is burning, tongue is burning, body is burning, mind is burning. So we can consider what this means. And we can consider what he meant when he was talking in the second part of the sutta. Like the first part is all just about how these things are all burning. And this is an encouragement just to contemplate the way that these things cause us agitation. You know, the way that that there are these that there is the arising of agitation or suffering. And to contemplate the possibility of not suffering in that way, that it is possible not to be constantly on fire. And there's a wonderful teaching that the Buddha gave to someone called Bahir, and I can't actually remember the whole story right now, but I just remember his name was Bahir. And the Buddha said, in the seeing, let there just be the seen. In the hearing, no, can't remember it actually. One of the things about getting older. But basically to be able to just see an object just for what it is, or just to contemplate the act of seeing, without allowing the perception and the triggering of all of the reactions to what we have seen. Similarly with hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and just noticing mind objects, contemplating memories, contemplating emotion, just to be able to see that this is how it is. So we could call it establishing mindfulness around these different sense impressions and just seeing them for what they are. You know, like listening to people speaking in a foreign language. That's just sound. You know, can we do that when people are speaking in a language that we can understand? Yes, that's just sound. I mean, maybe some of you are doing that right now as a way of coping with listening to this talk. Just hearing it as sound. It's an interesting possibility, just sound. It's actually quite a good strategy if you are having difficulty listening to something, just hearing it as sound. You know, if somebody is going on and on and on and on and on about something you don't really want to listen to, okay, just sound. This is just sound. And seeing how, when we just can listen in that way, or experience through the different senses in that way, it's actually quite cool. There's a sense of peacefulness. I think it's helpful to see this teaching that the Buddha gave as an incredibly skillful means, way of contemplating our life. And to recognize that if we it's a helpful antidote to the kind of passions of greed or aversion, lust or aversion or greed or whatever it is that can arise in relation to each of these senses. And I was actually just thinking how we also have to live in relation to one another. We have to live as human beings on this planet. We have to manage our lives. And it could be kind of awkward living in community if, whenever anybody spoke to us, we just contemplated it as sound and didn't actually pay attention to what they were saying. Because the words might actually have some important meaning for us, it's your turn to do the washing up today. This could be quite an important communication to somebody, or please shut the door, or many of the things that we say to each other are important in terms of communication. It is important that we use our senses just to find our way around. And one can appreciate that people who are impaired, who can't see or who can't hear or who can't smell or taste things or experience touch, in some ways it can be a very serious disability. It has implications, and they need to find ways of compensating. And so the senses are an important faculties. They're part of our life as human beings. Language and so on, and the animals too. Senses are extremely important for animals, just in terms of their survival. You can sort of just watch their ears, dogs and cats and rabbits, squirrels, just to see how their ears are constantly sort of like a kind of radar moving around, picking up sounds, because these sounds, it's a question of life and death. So it's not that the senses in themselves are bad. A very, very important aspect for our survival as human beings. And yet, they cause us so many problems when we, in our ways of interpreting what we perceive through the senses. It's really the mind, isn't it? It all boils down to mind, I think, because what we perceive through the senses makes an imprint in the mind, and that's where the reactivity happens. So the Buddha presented this really clear teaching using this simile of fire to the former Matadhera ascetics, for whom fire was a very important image in their lives, very much something that they worshipped and would contemplate a lot. And the Buddha was saying, but look, another way of contemplating fire is to see that it consumes, it devours, just to contemplate the possibility of allowing it to be extinguished, to cool down. So nibbana, this goal that each one of us has, this perfect liberation from all suffering. Nibbana just means cool. It's the word that they would use for describing when the rice was ready to eat. You don't eat rice when it's really, really hot. Because you burn yourself, you burn your tongue. But then when it cools down, then you can eat it, you can enjoy it. It can nourish the body. So we can Just contemplate this image of cooling. Now, some people might think, well, cool is like being dead. Like a dead body is very, extremely cool. But it can be helpful to contemplate how the Buddha, he was enlightened at the age of 35. And, so this nibbana is something that we can experience and we can still continue to live our lives. But just contemplating the possibility of being able to live our lives and to be less inflammable. How would that be? I notice in my own practice, things. It's just because I'm getting older. That's probably a large part of it. But I notice in my own practice now that there are certain things that I choose not to think about, because I just get upset if I think about them. Sometimes, in community things happen and people say, "Oh, have you heard about this? Isn't it terrible?" And maybe I have heard about it, and maybe it is terrible, but I can choose how I respond to that. This righteous indignation, which we can experience when you hear about something. You think, "Oh yes, it's terrible, really awful, shouldn't have happened," and we can get very upset, and we can upset everybody else. But we can also choose to just say, "Okay, I hear you. Yes, okay, this happened. And perhaps there's nothing we can do about it." So just hear it, receive the information, and leave it at that, rather than get into the whole chain of thinking about what should and shouldn't happen and why that person should or shouldn't have done that. So I suppose what really is most helpful in terms of our practice and in terms of contemplating this teaching is just to actually consider, to notice the times where you do feel upset about things, confused or agitated, disturbed. Or to notice when there's a very strong desire for something, whatever it might be. And to really consider, how is it right now? Is this peaceful? Is this calming? Is this something that I want to foster? Or not? Is this suffering or is this not suffering? Sometimes we think that, okay, the Buddha taught about, non-suffering, the ending of suffering, and if I'm suffering, I'm obviously doing something wrong. Well, yes and no, because if you're suffering, the important thing is to notice that you're suffering, to contemplate the suffering, because it's only through contemplating and understanding the suffering that you can then begin to contemplate, well, why am I suffering? What's this suffering about? And you can begin to notice the cause of suffering and to see how you can relinquish that. Relinquish that desire, to let go of that desire. and developing a taste for peace rather than a taste for excitement or agitation. So it's a lifelong practice, a lifelong study. Noticing suffering, noticing agitation, noticing confusion, noticing desire, and then questioning, is this peaceful? Is this something that I want to develop? And beginning to see, actually, no, it's hot, it burns, it's unpleasant, it's difficult. I'd rather not experience this. And then to contemplate ways of letting go, ways of cooling, calming, settling the mind. Years ago, when I was really sick, I realized that I didn't want to suffer anymore. Realizing that the importance of learning how to think in ways that bring about a sense of happiness and well-being, and just laying aside the kind of thinking that stirs up suffering, agitation in the mind. But I had to see, the suffering of certain kinds of thinking before I was able to let them go. And I haven't quite mastered it yet, I have to say. I'm still working at it. Because it's complicated. It's complicated by the sense of self, isn't it? The ego. Sometimes we don't want to let go. We don't want to set aside certain ways of thinking, certain ways of being, certain experiences. We want to have them. That grasping. But we can always notice. Just taking a moment to breathe. Taking a moment to question, how is it right now? How is it right now? How is my mind right now? Is it on fire? Or is there a sense of coolness, a sense of ease? What have I grasped onto? What am I holding on to? What's burning? How can I let go? Can I really just see, this is a sight, this is a sound, this is a fragrance or an odor, this is a taste, a bodily sensation, a state of mind. This is how it is right now. Fires don't just go out straight away because we want them to. But if we can learn how to stop feeding them, how to stop fanning the flames, how to stop throwing logs on, little by little, the fire cools. So in our lives here at Amaravati are manifold, different lives, each one of us, our own lives. We have the opportunity throughout the day to contemplate bigger fires, smaller fires, and occasionally to contemplate moments of calm, coolness. And to see how perhaps as our practice goes on, there's maybe fewer fires, fewer dramatic conflagrations, and we're able to allow a cooling to happen more quickly, as we become more skilled at letting go of the thing that's burning, putting it down. Ajahn Chah's advice, when he was asked about the most important thing, I think it was for a monk, but really we can talk about for a monk or a nun or for anybody who's engaged in this practice, following the teachings of the Buddha. The most important thing is to let go and to keep letting go of the things that burn, so that more and more there's a sense of coolness, the pleasure, the peace of nibbana when we really let go. So I think that's enough for this evening. I offer this for your contemplation, that it may lead each one of us to perfect liberation from every kind of suffering.